Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to Committee Model Review Group. We're in a different room today. If we hear a continuous ringing bell, there's no fire alarm expected, so we will go out through these doors, down to the front of the building and down the ramp towards the Central Library. We've got a fairly busy agenda today, but should we go around the room and do some quick introductions? So we'll start with the councillors from...
Councillor Heather Mack of Lockleys Ward.
I'm Rob Breyer, I'm Councillor for St George West.
Councillor Richard Eddie Bishops.
Councillor Andrew Brown, Hengrove. Sorry, Chair. Councillor Andrew Brown, Hengrove and Whitchurch Park Ward.
Councillor Cassell, Southmead.
Councillor Kydart, Southmead.
And Councillor Guy Poltney. I'll be chairing the committee from Cottam. And the officers...
Lucy Fleming, Head of Democratic Engagement and Executive Support.
Good morning, Tim O'Gara, Director of Legal and Democratic Services.
Taylor Meager, Clerk for the meeting.
And we are also ably joined by our technical support. For anyone watching online, thank you. It's all made possible by that officer. So, agenda item number 1, complete. Do we have any apologies for absence? I don't think we do. Do we have any declarations of interest? I don't think we do. Has everyone had a chance to look over the minutes of the previous meeting? Is anyone unhappy, wish to suggest any changes, or raise any outstanding actions? Terrific. We had 2 items of public forum. We don't have anyone in attendance either to speak to the statement or the question or to ask any supplementary questions, so we will note those and move on and come to the decision pathway. I'll ask Tim to introduce the report. This is obviously actions arising from our last meeting. Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll be very brief on this one, I think, because it is playing back the matters that were considered at the meeting in January, and just for final decision, or nothing's agreed until it's all agreed, but indicative position on these things for us to take forward. So the matters in the report are around the key decision threshold, and there was a discussion last time about the appropriate level for that. Information in key decision reports, and the way that the information is presented, and the use of options and background papers and appendices. There's a little bit of detail about the decision pathway for non-key decision reports, which is something that we routinely do at the moment, but there's some detail in there around that. There was some discussion about the consistency of the notes from the Policy Committee Chair's briefing, so we've covered that off in the report as well. Likewise with the timing of agenda setting meetings, which I think we've discussed a few times in terms of bringing forward the agenda setting meetings. The publication of the diaries of the leader is also referenced in there, something which we have committed to doing. I'd need to check with colleagues as to whether or not that's actually been done now, but I think we are almost there with that. And then finally, the formalisation of the amendments process, which we did touch upon last time and has been the subject of discussion in the working group a few times, and it'd be good to just get endorsement of that process so that we can get that formally embedded into our constitution in due course. So as you'd expect, there's a summary of the matters that the report covers, just to guide you in terms of finalising your position on these things. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Tim. I've got some notes against the agenda, just from my discussion last time. I'll come to Richard first.
I'm broadly happy with the following. This issue of the of inflation, the actual element of the criteria of the key decisions. Now, at my this was raised as a meeting of committee. You say that no seems to be echo of that. There are some members who favour raising it, some reducing it. So I'm personally happy to keep it where it is. Where the officers, I think they pragmatically seemed to hint they were happy with that. The only thing regarding your para 9 questions or points, I'd make one suggestion with respect under C, where it talks about producing reports at short notice. Could I include the word relatively short notice before? Because I don't think we meant that suddenly officers were going to be charged with producing notice reports or hardly any notice. That seems to be accurate and supportive of in the context.
I wouldn't have any issue with that, and but I do think it becomes pertinent on one of the other points as well that we may come to. Anyone else want to comment on that? Andrew?
I think I'd be happy with that. I think I was a bit thrown by paragraph 4 with regards to the decision pathway of non-key decision reports, because it doesn't quite, it speaks in the sort of present tense about the current situation. It doesn't quite tally with the impression I had got from officers when we were looking at potentially bringing an update report to committee for information. But I support in terms of the recommendation, definitely support that principle, and I think adding in the word relatively, I think I have no issue with.
I would say it does say relatively under 4 under decision pathway non-key decision reports. It's just tidying up the language so that the language in the recommendation on page 9 matches the language on page 8. That's absolutely, I don't have an issue with that. Fantastic. So as far as key decision threshold goes, we've generally agreed. The voices arguing for more, the voices arguing for less have levelled out. It's going to no change it. That's fine. Information in key decision reports. I do think. Oh, Kaz.
Yeah, I just wanted to say on this one, it says including the use of options. I've said this before, I do want to see options coming to these reports to know what sort of things the officers have actually considered. Sometimes it seems to me that just quite often we just get a single option to kind of vote on. And I don't know if that's the best option or not. I would like to know what the decision making behind that has been. So that's quite key to me.
I think there's a difference between an option and a recommendation, if that makes sense. I think very often what we get are recommendations, but I do think it's also for members to start elucidating what those options are slightly further in advance. One of the things I quite welcome for this is the agenda conference being moved back a week, which I think is under. It's relevant to 8 in terms of formalising the amendments process, but 6, timing of the agenda setting meetings moving back from 2 weeks out to 3 weeks out should give officers more time to work through options. It does mean that there's a shorter distance between possibly members seeing the initial draft report and having time to feed in, but I do think having that extra week in there should be helpful. If that proves not to be enough, we can always look at it again. Councillor Mack.
Yeah, I think options and how and when the agenda setting meetings work are very much interlinked questions. And, we're in the interesting position we've got Andrew as a committee chair here. I don't think anyone's a vice chair. Sorry, of course you are. I think that this is something that even I'd say I have a view on, I see a bit more of this, but that I am still not quite, I want to see more options. I want to see more of the whole committee, or at least the party group leads as a slightly easier way to involve, be able to suggest options. I am not quite convinced what step in the process that is, and I actually maybe have a slightly frustrating proposal, which is Chair and Vice Chair of this group did come to committee chairs once, but I actually would maybe think, I think we're clear on some of the outcomes that we want in terms of more options, in terms of leads and vice chairs being able to help with that development. I'm just not quite clear in what are the changes to get us there. And I wonder, I think it's some combination of Dem services and also committee chairs having a bit of a conversation about how that's going to work better. And so I feel like I'm creating another step of work here, but I do think maybe having another conversation there with that group would be helpful. But I'm also very interested in what Andrew's got to say, because he might have all the answers as the committee chair in the room.
Councillor Brown.
So, two things on this. I think moving the agenda date back or forward, whichever way around that works, is helpful, but I'm not sure it will help in terms of producing options reports, because if the officers are expected to produce worked up options for committee, I think they need much more. They'll need much more to do that much further down the track in terms of the report generation, rather than looking to, flesh out options at that later stage once it's gone to the party group leads at the agenda setting meeting. It will help though with other scenarios. So, for example, I had a scenario where the report that came to the agenda setting meeting hadn't been progressed as much as the chair and vice chair of my committee might have expected. And then we had the added input from the other group leads, and requested a number of changes and a tweak to the recommendation. And officers didn't have the time to do it between the agenda setting meeting and the date for publication. So that one ended up being deferred to the following committee. Had they had that extra week, that might have that situation might have been rectified.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Tim, then Richard, if that's okay.
If I could just give an officer perspective on some of the points that Councillor Brown has made there. So we recognise that further work is needed to ensure that options have been developed in a timely way for policy committee reports, and we are continuing to do training for officers around report writing generally, but with further emphasis on the need to articulate options in reports. So we've come from a starting place when we had the first policy committees back in June last year, where it was clearly identified as an issue that we needed to tackle. We're working on it. It will take some time, but we're moving things to that place. So it is something that we will continue to work on. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Richard.
I fully support Heather's proposal. We have a further discussion about how we can address this option. What I would say, there is a danger of putting all the options out there, because often at Chair's briefing, we're having the first meeting months in advance of it going to committee, and you could eliminate there things which are politically unacceptable, perhaps for manpower or for financial reasons or policy reasons, and keeping it in there, it could frighten the horses unnecessarily if they're not actually valid, genuine options. So it is worthwhile honing it down to the ones which are actually going to impact people.
Councillor Self.
Yes, I accept what you're saying, Richard, but I still would like to see, maybe even if it's just one sentence, we considered X, but discounted it because of Y. Yeah. And that would just help me to know that it's been thought of.
Councillor Mack.
I think Councillor O'D's point about scaring the horses is a really interesting one. That we can talk a lot about transparency of decision-making, transparency with the public, and often being able to talk about the difficult options, the multiple options that are out there, And I sort of hope for a situation where we can and we are presenting more and more options. I had a really, I think I maybe mentioned this last time, but I think it is really interesting because it does absolutely agree. I went to a community meeting and someone was saying, actually, this level of transparency worries people, it scares people. And I am hoping that we can get there, but I think it does take really good communication. I actually think it's going to be quite difficult for maybe a year or two, and then hopefully the whole city will get more and more used to the idea that so for example, with the budget, we published what we're calling options from the officers, not proposals that things politicians wanted to do. But I think that we have quite a lot of work to get that level of trust and being truly honest about what we're doing and not scaring people around that. We've got a difficult journey to take there.
Thank you, Councillor Mack. Councillor Dudd.
Yeah, thank you. I've got some kind of fundamental issues with the decision pathway, really. Because what I've seen so far is, especially with the Environment Committee, all of the reports have been responding to officer proposals rather than officers responding to political direction from elected members. So it's kind of fundamental in terms of the origins of policy, because at the moment I don't think there's enough political control over the origin of policy, and we've definitely on the Environment Committee, we're just responding to officers' proposals. So I think there needs to be other ways that we can instruct officers to bring reports about specific issues that we want to see at policy committees, because at the moment we're just responding to what officers want and not what politicians want who've been elected by the people. And I think a way around that is being able to submit motions to policy committees to instruct officers to bring forward a report on certain issues with options. I get everything subject to the decision pathway around finance advice, equality impact advice. I'm not trying to say we can bring forward motions to circumvent all those issues, but to trigger work being done. Because at the moment, as I say, I can only speak for the Environment Committee, but I can see it. I kind of see it happening on other committees as well, but I don't know the full picture. But I've been very disappointed with the Environment Committee, because I thought that might have been the one committee where there'd be loads of ideas coming forward, and it's just responding to either policy that was from the last administration or just stuff that officers are bringing forward. And I think there needs to be much more political leadership on the Environment Committee, and I'm sure it's the same across all the committees as well.
I'll come to Councillor Breyer next. I would ask how, as someone who doesn't sit on any policy committees, because while this is not a policy committee, it adopts much the same function, but I'm aware that other members both chair and attend other policy committees. I would be interested in your feedback on this.
I think it's different for different committees. I think it depends on both the chair, how officers engage with the chair, all those aspects. For instance, my experience in Transport Committee is that we do have fairly strong political direction based on, frankly, the Green Manifesto commitments, as we're trying to push those through the committee, and I think that has come out. Yeah. Okay, well, then we agree on that. Yeah, but I think you just characterised it as being all the same. Okay, well, the full picture is I think that it varies, and I don't think it's all one way, and I suppose the broader question is really whether we want it to be that way, whether we want it to be really at the discretion of the chair, effectively, about how much it is officer-led or councillor-led. And for me, I do think it should be a bit more councillor-led. I think I agree with you, and more politically directed, but I'm not sure there's a way of is there a way to constitutionally provide that? I mean, what's the proposal?
No, well, I think I should be able to submit a motion that instructs the relevant officer to bring a report back on a certain policy issue at a committee, and then it's up to the officers to bring the options back and make sure it aligns with all the key decision-making process criteria. And if I bring that forward and people think it's a bad idea and they don't want the officers to do the work, they can vote me down, can't they?
But is there
I think it's a good idea and it's worth doing.
Is there a limit on that? Is there a limit on that, though, Kai? Because if you've got 9 members of the committee, and let's say just for argument's sake, I know this is hypothetical, for argument's sake, they all bring a motion to one committee to say 9 different proposals that then the officers have to go away. That
Well,
does
I
have
guess-
resource implications, doesn't it? So there's got to be some way of
I guess
deciding.
you could say like one per group or something like that. I don't know, something like that per meeting. And I imagine it'll be rarely used, but
We have
yeah.
we have a clear proposal. I will come to Councillors Mack, Eddie, and then Tim. I have thoughts on this as well, which are coming, but let's start.
Yeah, I mean, my view is a combination of the work planning and the agenda setting meetings are the opportunity for this. And I would be interested to hear what went to the 2 different work planning meetings that we have had thus far, and presumably had agreement by more than one voice, because, you know, if the 3 members of yours on committee, and even better if it was something that others wanted to bring forwards, if there was something that had agreement from multiple members on the committee to put on the work plan, and then no one did anything to move it on. I think that there are those opportunities. If that's not happening, I mean, let's look if it's on the list on the forward plan. But there have been 2 afternoons of work planning, which is where that would happen. So I'm just interested if that's not working.
Yeah, I just think there's an issue with these work planning sessions, and it's about accountability. I think coming together and putting ideas on post-it notes and then throwing up in the air and you land with a position, I don't think there's any accountability. At least if I could put a motion forward to say, I don't know, on the Environment Committee, I want a report on, I'm not happy with what we're doing on waste enforcement. I think we should be doing this. And I'll put a proposal to the committee, and then the officer goes away, works up options, and comes back maybe the next one or the meeting afterwards. After that's work's done. So there's accountability to that, so people know where the ideas come from. Rather than like a load of ideas on post-it notes, who's responsible for that? No.
So, if I may, my speakers list is now including Councillor Eddy, Councillor South, Tim. I would like to bring in Tim at this point, just before I come to Councillor Eddy, but I'd also ask, Tim, could you elucidate the ways in which members of committee can put something on the agenda for that committee?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I was going to do a little bit of that because so the point that Councillor Mack has made in terms of the formal work programme setting workshop and the agenda briefing are the 2 principal formal ways that we've put in place to canvass the views of all members of committees to ensure that things can come onto the agendas. The work programme setting workshop it had an awful lot of officer support. It was member led. And the work that flowed out of that was the iterations of the forward plans, which were, as they need to be, signed off by the chairs of the relevant committees. And I think we have to recognise that under the committee model, the chairs of a committee are the ones that are ultimately responsible for managing the agenda and the work programmes for their respective committees. Be that notwithstanding that, there are other ways, should the sort of mechanisms that we've got in place through those arrangements not give you the comfort that the matters that you want to see considered by a committee are being addressed, and those can be raised informally with the chair. They can be raised with the relevant chief officers, I guess. But the nuclear option, so to speak, is that 2 members of the committee can requisition a meeting if their matter is not being has not been considered as part of a formal agenda setting arrangement. Hopefully we don't get to that point, because the suggestion that there would be a requisition of an extraordinary meeting of a committee to deal with something would hopefully ensure that it actually ended up on a formal agenda for a planned meeting. So that there are various ways and means of doing it. If we were looking at a model that involved motions being brought by individual councillors to policy committees, that in theory that is something that could be done. However, we would need to, as I think Councillor Eddy or Councillor Breyer said, we would need to put certain safeguards around that in terms of the number of those that can be brought for any given meeting in a similar way to the way that we do for full council. So those are my sort of views on some of this, Chair, that are hopefully helpful and provide a degree of clarity for the working group. Thank you.
come to Councillor Ellie next, because I'm aware he's waiting a while, then Councillor Self, Councillor Brown.
I think Rob was absolutely right. We need to actually, which is one of the purposes of this working group, to ensure consistency across the policy committees. He's believed, which I believe as well, that there's consistent political leadership on transport. I would have to say I believe there is consistent political leadership on homes and housing delivery, my policy committee. But let's remember, it's a complete sea for from last my committee and I discussed after a few committee meetings, because most of the points made by members seem to consist of questions to officers rather than debate. And I think it's reflected with a new brief ahead actually debate issues. So I would suggest, the point I just made is one I did think very seriously about, and then early in this administration after May. I'm less concerned now, but I think, but can I respectfully remind members we're only 9 months in? I would think it's been a sea change, and I would expect, certainly, within this year, for committers to find their own feet.
Yes, so full council is an opportunity for motions and debate, but we only have a certain number every year, and there's only 2 motions debated, and there's an issue about the sort of, they come from Labour to different groups and so on. The work programme setting, I think it's a good meeting, don't get me wrong, but it is a kind of private meeting. There's no transparency of what's put on these post-its. The public don't see what's being put on there. And that concerns me because I know this administration are interested in transparency. So from that point of view, having more opportunity to bring motions and also transparency, I kind of understand where Kai is coming from.
Thank you. I'm going to come to
Can I just
very
make one-
briefly
yeah,
if it's on that specific point.
There are times when you'll need to instruct officers to do things. So I think that this idea that it's all like officers are consulting us and things like that, that's all good. But there are times when we'll need to instruct officers, and we should have the right to do that. And I don't see how in the committee system, I don't really see where we get the opportunity to do that anymore.
Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things in here. I take Kai's point about the, how we get things on agendas for committees, and we do have the work programme settings. I think there is, there is a challenge in those because I don't think we've got those working as well as they could do. And there will inevitably be people disappointed as well, because there will be ideas brought to those that won't be able to get onto a work programme because of officer resource. And we've in terms of the limits on task and finish groups or inquiry days or whatever, and the capacity to deliver those. I think there is an issue around, and I hold my hands up to this because I'm just thinking through whether I've done this, how we communicate that both to members of the committee, the outcomes of that, both to members of the committee and to the public about what work is going to be going on. Because again, if you're holding a task and finish group, that is not public work. That is not something that's going to be in the open session of committee. But I think we need to work out how we communicate that. There will be work in the background on high streets, for example. Within my committee, we're going to have a task and finish group looking at issues around our retail spaces. So there's that element, and then there is the broader point about how chairs and committees start directing move the direction of travel in terms of actual key reports that come through committee. And again, that's something I think that as we've gone through, and coming back to Richard's point, we've been finding our feet over the past few months and actually getting to, and I feel like we're sort of starting to get to the point where we're maybe feel more comfortable within our briefs in order to start doing more of that directional work in terms of looking at what's coming through on the pipeline and how we add to that forward plan, as opposed to what's just coming through the system anyway. So that's a few little points.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. I'm going to come to Lucy, and then I'm going to come in, and then Councillor Mack.
Members, just wanted to just advise you on one of the learning points for us around the work programme setting workshop. So as you all know, but for the benefit of the public, so we asked for suggestions from members for items for policy development topics, etc. There's a cross-party workshop where they're discussed, and then those items are either taken forward as committee reports, which go onto the forward plan, or some of them are they become member briefings, at least in the first instance, so members can find out a bit more about the topic and decide what the next steps for that item should be. Or alternatively, some of them end up being task groups. So we've got 18 task groups, which are policy development deep dives identified at the moment. But I think for me, and I'm sure Tim would agree, the bit that's missing is probably what we should do in future is have a formal report back to each of the policy committees saying, well, members at the workshop had all of these suggestions. This is what happened to them, just so that there's that added layer of transparency. So I hadn't discussed this with any members yet, but I can see lots of nodding. So hopefully that's something that everybody agrees we should do.
Apologies. And Lucy, could you confirm, is that, sorry, I may have missed the very start, I think that sounds like a really good idea. Was that for the agenda setting, as in for what period of agenda setting would that happen?
So this is relating to the work programme setting workshop. So all the, every 6 months, yeah. The next one's due around June time, I think.
Thank you. I was going to say that I think deals with some of my, but not quite all of my concerns. I think that's a good start. I would say I do sympathise a lot with the points from Councillor Self and Councillor Dudd in terms of what we're asking is for all parties, what we corporately are asking is for all parties to come to what were in essence private meetings, put all your ideas forward and leave it to us, we'll get back to you. Now, the cynic might say, or someone who's possibly been around this place a very long time, might say that might be an opportunity to provide a report back as to why something can't be done, or to take it forward, for the administration to take it forward themselves is a good idea. And I have heard tell of that happening under every administration I've been in proximity to in this place one way or another. So I think what Lucy suggested, well, I'm sure that suggestion, I think, is good for establishing these ideas came from these places so that they can be taken forward. That sounds like a good start. I have to admit, my issue with the way that agendas were set in those 6 monthly meetings was because they all happen simultaneously. If you don't sit on a policy committee, or whether you do or not, I might want to set or have input into the agenda for, say, Environment Sustainability Committee and the Transport Committee. But suddenly I'm not able to be in two places at once. So we clearly need more than that. Equally, because I'm not on any of the committees, I can't then show up to the agenda briefings or the agenda setting meetings. I could put things in public forum, I suppose, but that doesn't strike me as the simplest way through. So I do think...
One thing then, because obviously we need to be mindful of officer resource, don't we? And
we do.
Time and money and that. So I guess Tim outlined the options there. So for example, I think having the ability to put a motion forward saves money, because otherwise we're just going to be, calling meetings ad hoc, and think of the time, costs, money, the irritation. So why not just allow us to bring whatever business we want
I do agree.
in a
I think-
motion at every scheduled meeting?
I do think the danger in that, for what it's worth, is that what you end up with is discussing the merits of each motion in isolation. And there needs to be some way of going, and we now need to prioritise these over the course of the work programme. Now, there is nothing, as I understand it currently, to stop a member putting a motion, as it were, in through the public forum process, putting it on record and saying, I want the committee to discuss this and to instruct officers. And it would be perfectly reasonable for a chair to call a vote at that, on that, or to get a show of hands on that, to say, we can add this to the agenda for the work programme, or we can ask officers to look into how much time producing this would take, or something along those lines. But that might provide a little bit more transparency and a little bit more accountability. The question then becomes, is there actually a vote on it? Or is there? I think that's something where we would need to look at a proposal as to how that happens. It is currently the case, I'm given to understand, that any motion to full council is referred to the relevant policy committee, and I have had quite a lot of suggestions over the last few weeks as to how we should reform the motions process for full council, and I do think that neatly could play into some suggestions as to how we reform that to enable more motions to be heard at full council that could then go to policy committees. That could be one way that I think we could take it forward. I do think, apologies for going on, this is a big complex area, that there is a bit of an assumption that all the policy committees do is look at developing new policy or reviewing policy as it needs to come. In other words, they're not really a mechanism for looking at something that might be going wrong right now. And I do think we need a better mechanism for that as well. I've seen too many hands. I will go Kai to come back on this point, then Heather, then Andrew.
I just wonder if Tim could help me with the scenario. So 2 councillors call a meeting about an issue. So what happens then? Is just a discussion, or is there an item on the agenda that we can vote on? Or so if it's just a discussion, then that's good. You could just end up going around in circles on an issue and not move it forward or get a clear political position on a particular issue. So if we can call 2 of us can call a meeting, and that we can put a proposal to the vote at that meeting, then I think I think maybe that kind of covers off where I'm trying to get to with this. But if it doesn't, then I think, well, we probably need a motions system.
Tim, could I ask, is that the case when 2 members call a meeting? Can they add items to the agenda for that meeting as part of that process?
The relevant provisions for this are in Committee Procedure Rule 3, which deals with extraordinary meetings. Okay, and it's only a short section, so I'm going to read it all verbatim. So, those listed below may request the proper officer, which is me, to call a committee meeting in addition to ordinary meetings. So, by resolution of the committee, the chair, the proper officer, or any 2 members of the relevant committee, if they have signed a requisition presented to the chair and the chair has refused to call a meeting or has failed to call a meeting within 7 days of the presentation of the requisition. So 2 members of the committee, in the scenario that's being discussed here, will raise a requisition to call a meeting with the chair, and if the chair doesn't call a meeting within 7 days, then those 2 members, which through myself would then call that public meeting. The agenda for an extraordinary meeting in those circumstances will specify the matters that the meeting will deal with, which shall be limited to the matters set out in the requisition to call the meeting. The usual public forum arrangements would still apply for that extraordinary meeting. So the requisition needs to be very specific about the matter that the extraordinary meeting needs to be called to deal with, and then the agenda will cover. We should only cover that particular issue if you're in the realms of having an extraordinary meeting. If the chair chooses to call to add that item to an agenda, I think it's probably resolved at that point. Whether that's within 7 days or otherwise, provided that it gets on the agenda, I'd be satisfied that we've dealt with the requisition in those circumstances. However, if the chair says no, then a meeting will be called as soon as the diary would accommodate.
I'll come to Councillor Mack.
Thank you. I think we need to consider what are we looking for here? Accountability or publicity? So I agree. I do think, and this is not a criticism. This is the learning of the new system. I do think that there was a lacking of accountability in terms of the stages, and actually, I think what Lucy has just said about the report would be a really good step in terms of things going on the work planning, when and how are they going to be dealt with for all the various means. But we're operating in a committee model. I would hope that we can work together as a committee, and we just had a reference to ideas being taken and put forward by administration. Reports to committees come from officers, potentially with a number of options, which anyone can vote from. It's not a success of the administration. This is not the administration's proposal or policy. So I would hope that all in this work, in an accountable work planning process, where we work through options as a committee and the report comes forwards, and the party who has championed that report can vote on it and get it forwards, you can still take, you can still take that as a win. I worry that the idea of doing all of this in public is just for publicity. And I think that the Stapleton Road allotments is the perfect example of that. I support an idea, came to budget, around promoting growing spaces. But it has never been asked to go on a work plan for the committee to do the relevant amount of work to actually get it through. And if it was one of those ideas that we actually wanted to get it through, we could have worked together, or that ESAs could have worked together as a committee to find a way for that to work, or public health and communities. So are we trying to make this public so that you can publicly talk about all of your ideas, or are we actually trying to find a system where the right ideas work through the policy development process so that they can be passed? But I also do say that the accountability and the ability to get more, especially interesting, like that policy development onto agendas needs to happen, acknowledging how much resource it takes and how much resource we've had, how difficult it's been just getting used to this new system. I do hope that we'd find more resource for policy development over the next 6 to 12 months.
I'll come to Councillor Eddy, then Councillor Self. I appreciate Councillor Mack was making a point by way of example, and I do thank her for her patience waiting to be called. There was more of a delay than I would have liked. Apologies, that was my bad. I would please ask members, I appreciate the budget is still very fresh in everyone's minds. Let's not please relitigate that. That was a good example, I think, I hope. But Councillor Eddy, then Councillor Self, then Councillor Brown.
I think we're in danger of seeking to rewrite the rules or the Constitution to allow for perhaps a nuclear or confrontational option. Now, my experience is primarily based upon my policy committee, though I expect many others operate in a similar way. And I have to say, I found the chair to be remarkably inclusive in terms of taking members' suggestions up, running with them, bringing things back, asking whether the committee members wished to be more involved in monitoring of various things, or even inviting ward or members to various relevant parts of chair's briefings. So I think that we ought to encourage this more rather than have a them and us approach. And there is a danger, in my view, of seeking to tweak or change radically the rules to take account of that.
Thank you, Councillor Brown, then Councillor Self. Apologies, wrong way round. Councillor Self and Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. And I apologise, I might have to go back to the Budget Council, but I wanted to make a point about 9G amendments, and it kind of feeds into that in a way. At Budget Council, we were accused of, by one party, of that was an inappropriate way for them to bring amendments. Another party was saying that this is the best way of bringing it because some amendments are kind of cross-policy. So as a sort of new member, I left that feeling a bit confused. But when I sort of think our party or parties bring amendments to to meetings. I think they do it because they've got some passion for them. For example, I talked on night buses, and I've got a passion for night buses and people getting home safely from work. I don't regard that as publicity. I regard that as something I'm passionate about and want to be debated in open. So when it comes to amendments in the Transport Committee, yeah, we've had a few issues with amendments. We've been learning the process as we go along. Sometimes we want to bring amendments and we then find out their financial implications, and we kind of learn that as we go along. Other times we want to bring amendments and it kind of is doing it on an ad hoc basis in the meeting. You need to maybe take an adjournment, and it just feels a little bit flaky in some of our Transport Committee meetings. So I think you're looking at the 9G. I think that's something we need to spend a bit of time maybe thinking about and getting written down better.
Councillor Brown.
I feel like I'm circling back a little bit, but to pick up on something you said earlier, Chair, about how the role of the committee needs to be about more than just approving new stuff or ongoing stuff. There needs to be a sort of review mechanism, and I don't know if we've necessarily, and I don't know if it's really within this remit of this committee, but I think there might be some things in terms of reports on service provision that need to be standing reports, or as well as the performance metrics. But maybe within the individual directorates, there might be a need to look at how we monitor ongoing performance. So, for example, planning service within my remit, we had a report a number of months ago about where it was at in terms of getting towards de-designation, and we're looking at doing an update to that. And I anticipate that, if that remains a live issue, we will have, potentially more regular reports on performance there. So I think there is, and there is a broader point around the performance metrics that are presented to us because of the way they are presented. They are reported quarterly, but of course our meetings don't always necessarily fit in nicely with the cycle. So we sometimes see stuff that's actually quite old data. And there's also, we also have a very specific issue about some of the targets that are spread across a year, but actually don't reflect seasonality in terms of the way that things work in practice. But that's getting too granular. Sorry.
Okay. I've noticed a dip in the collegiate sense of the room from the start of the meeting, and I am keen to move on to looking at scrutiny and escalation. So, in terms of some suggestions for moving forwards on this, in terms of the rest of the report, apologies, I'm just looking through now. There is an amendments process that was intended to be circulated ahead of this meeting. I understand there were some problems from committee members with the link, and that will be available to you now if it hasn't been already. I would genuinely encourage members to look at the process for amending reports to committees, how that happens, any concerns or issues, please raise them. Other than that, I will assume that we're reasonably safe to begin the process for constitutionalising that amendments process. In terms of the publications of diaries for the leader, I believe that's now been agreed and that's being taken forward, unless there's any dispute or debate on that.
It is up. I've just
It's up.
shared the link.
Wonderful. Thank you, Councillors Mack and Lucy. Timing of agenda setting meetings, I feel like we have consensus. Bring it back by a week, give people more time. The notes of the policy committee briefings, I have had feedback on this that these need to be consistent. These need to be kept in the same place. Members need to be aware where they are. And it would be helpful if notes of committee chair briefings were circulated, at least a link to them with the agenda for the following meeting of the committee. Some of this may be already happening. This is what I've been told is necessary. I will come very quickly to Councillor Breyer, then Councillor Eddy.
I just wanted to clarify, if I receive, obviously on the Transport Committee, I receive the minutes, I'm allowed to forward those on to other councillors? That's allowed? Because I've done that a number of times.
The test is, respectfully, are we entitled to withhold it? I don't
Right.
see any lawful reason why we should be. I
Obviously,
will come back to Kai and Kaz's, the issue that has been raised around motions to policy committee. Sorry, I thought we'd put everything else to bed, so I'll ask Tim to come back on this quickly.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So we're straying into various areas of the Council's constitution here, but in short, members who are appointed to a particular policy committee are entitled to information that relates to that policy committee to enable them to discharge the duties that they have as a consequence of being on that committee. Therefore, they are provided with the information that arises from those briefings, and that's part of them being able to discharge their duties. Sharing that information with a member that is not on that committee would not meet the requirements under our access to information procedure rules, because that information is not required for the members of other committees who are not discharging those responsibilities. That's a well-established principle of local government law. The nature of those briefings are private meetings, and the starting point would be that in order to ensure the effective conduct of public affairs, and I've raised this in previous meetings of this working group, but if we received freedom of information requests for that information, then I would be declining those requests on the basis that there needs to be a safe space to enable councillors and officers to have private, confidential discussions. So that's really the position, Chair. Happy to provide further clarification if necessary.
Come to Councillor Eddy and Councillor Bryan.
Very briefly, I just wanted to remind members regarding the notes of Chair's weekly briefings. At our last meeting, Lucy undertook to ensure there's greater consistency about the practice. So that's an action point which is administrative, doesn't require any rule changes.
Come to Councillor Bryan next.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify the reason for forwarding it on to people is because if it's a ward issue and that person hasn't been included, it has direct impact on them. I see this I see this from your perspective, Tim, but I also think that if you've got information that is about something that may happen to someone's ward and they don't have that information, then they should be availed of that. I don't see any reason why a discussion that takes place on something that is a local issue for them is not their business. It seems to me that is part of our role as councillors, to pass on that information to the people who need to know it.
So thank you, Chair. All I would ask, I don't disagree with what Councillor Bryan has just said. However, I would always encourage members to come and seek advice in those circumstances before sharing that information more widely. There may well be a legitimate reason why local ward members should receive that information. However, we need to ensure that it's done in a way that is managed appropriately. So yeah, please come and seek advice if you feel that is necessary. By all means, contact myself or any of my colleagues in Legal and Democratic Services. Thank you.
I'm literally pausing for thought. I'm looking, for what it's worth, at the Members' Code of Conduct. And it's clear that holders of public office should act and take decisions in an open and transparent manner, and information should not be withheld from the public unless there are clear and lawful reasons for doing so. Now, I can envision there being times, and I'm fairly sure, and I will look through, because my feeling was that there is somewhere else in the constitution of the council, I will do my best to find it, that makes it very, very clear that unless something is withheld for reasons of commercial confidentiality or breach of GDPR, unless there's a legal reason why we cannot release the information, that the rule was that we should. And if that reason is members wish to discuss things with officers and officers wish to discuss things with members in the formulation of policy, but it would be difficult, troubling, whatever it might be, that to me does not strike me as meeting that test. If that's the case, then we either need to amend the Constitution or we need to change our behaviour. I will look through, I will seriously consider this ahead of the next meeting, but I do think Councillor Breyer's point has merit, and I do think we need to start being more open around these things. I don't like the idea that these discussions are happening privately and not knowing what we don't know, and not knowing what the reason is that something might not be out there in the public domain. So I'd say I'll ask members to come back with specific proposals to the next meeting if they want to do anything on this area, and I will ask that we go back just to resolve this issue around motions. I had an indication from Councillor Dudd, I've just had an indication from Tim. I have a horrible feeling I may have ignored a previous indication from Councillor Brown. So I'll go Councillor Dudd and then Tim, and then we will move on.
Well, I'm probably going to say what Tim's saying.
Tim.
I mean, he's just given a lawful reason why that information can be withheld, and I imagine there's loads of case law and around that, and which strengthens that legal point. But I guess it's in what scenario that provision's used, isn't it? That's probably. And I think, yeah, early private conversations between officers and lead members around policy is a lawful use of that provision, isn't it? So I don't think it's about our constitution here, it's about the law of the land. And I think Tim's probably going to say that, isn't he?
I was going to say something along those lines, Councillor Dudd. Yes. So our access to information procedure rules set out the statutory legal framework around access to information for councillors, but also for members of the public, and it includes some clearly defined, well-established principles around exempt information. The FOI regime is separate to that again, and enables members of the public to access information that that is held by the council. But there is a very detailed technical legal regime that sits around information held by the council and the rights and responsibilities of members of the public and officers in terms of how that information is handled. It's probably a 3-hour masterclass at some point if the working group want it. But I suggest for present purposes we come out of this rabbit hole.
Let's come out of this rabbit hole then. Let's come out of this rabbit hole then. In which case, if any members, including myself for that matter, want to bring a proposal to the next meeting on this, by all means. In which case, we'll move back to this. I hope briefly. Question of motions to policy committees. I will add something that I've been thinking about since the end of the committee model working group, which was once upon a time we looked at petitions to policy committees and asked the question as to what the threshold would be for ensuring a decision, for ensuring a debate must take place at policy committee rather than would permit a discussion of it at policy committee. And somewhere between the last meeting that I was at and the drafting of the new constitution, my understanding of what I thought was happening had changed. At the moment, people can bring petitions to policy committees in order to add something effectively to the agenda with a number of signatories. I think that may be a threshold solution to the motions issue. I'm looking to colleagues to see, do you think that would, in other words, would it deal with your concerns if you were able to bring a motion by way of a petition to a policy committee with a certain number of members?
Well, do you mean members of the public or members of the council?
As in you would need to get a signatures of members of the public.
Oh, I don't think that really does, because I mean we're elected, we're elected to put forward views, aren't we, and obviously represent our residents and the views of our party and our own convictions. So I don't think we should have to rely on that petition to be able to do that.
Okay. In which case,
I was purely going to add, to be fair, a petition purely requests something. It doesn't table an amendment or a motion, of course, so I understand Kai's feeling of
Fair enough.
that it's inadequate.
fair enough. Tim?
So two things, if I may, Chair. So there's already built into our arrangements the ability for petitions to be presented to policy committees, and that was something that we agreed as a new thing when we did the original work. I'm sensing that maybe we need to take away the points that have been raised about motions and come back. You know, we've got a section on the work programme that looks at procedural rules, and this probably sits more naturally with that part of the work programme, and we could go away and reflect on some of the points that have been raised today around how, you know, matters can be put onto the agendas, and whether we can work up some options around how that might be achieved without, you know, going with the nuclear option that I raised earlier. And, you know, if the working group's happy for us to do that, then, you know, we can take that as an action.
Thank you, Tim. I think that would be most welcome. I would, from my own point of view, just make one plea, which is that we consider the ability of all members of council to get things onto the agendas of policy committees somehow, even when they don't necessarily sit on that policy committee. That would strike me as being a helpful thing, whatever the threshold, however high it might be. I do think that's something that should be possible, at which point, unless anyone objects, shall we move on to scrutiny and escalation. Would anyone just like, for what it's worth, we've got another 55 minutes this meeting, would anyone like to just take a 5-minute comfort break, just for everyone to reset a little bit? That was quite a tough debate. Let's take 5, back in MO. I think we're ready to go again. Fantastic. Right, everybody, I want to thank all members for that. Whilst it might not have felt massively comfortable all the time, I do think we actually got through some interesting stuff there. So let us, at that point, move on to scrutiny and escalation. Tim?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So this report is about scrutiny and policy development. The report itself sets out what our current arrangements are, and it has two appendices which set out for you Annex 1 and Annex 2 of the committee procedure rules, which cover off the particular arrangements that we have in place in respect of policy development, in respect of Appendix 1, and the escalation panel in respect of Appendix 2. The report starts with the principle that scrutiny is a matter that we considered at length as part of the original work to establish the new arrangements, and that principle being that the scrutiny of decisions will take place as part of the decision-making process in each policy committee. It then talks about the various statutory scrutiny arrangements that, notwithstanding that sort of broad principle, we are nevertheless required to have. The first of which is a statutory health scrutiny committee, and that sits as a subcommittee of the Public Health and Communities Committee. We also have the Community Safety Partnership and flood risk management and coastal erosion risk management scrutiny functions, which sit with the relevant policy committees. That's the Public Health and Communities Committee and the Environment and Sustainable Communities Committee. Then the report goes on to make some reference to the Finance Subcommittee, which is, again, a subcommittee of the Strategy and Resources Committee. And then the report sets out in detail some of the arrangements that we have for policy development and task and finish groups. I'm not going to refer to that in detail, but I will touch on, as we've done already in this meeting, the work programme setting workshops, which are used to inform the policy development activity of policy committees and establish the task and finish groups. And then finally, the report talks about the escalation panel, which was established as a check and balance on decision making and aligns to Article 14 of the Council's Constitution in terms of the principles of decision making that should apply across the board and provides the framework within which matters can be escalated. So yes, there's two appendices in the report, as I've said. The first of which deals with the general rules around policy development and task and finish groups, and the second of which deals with the rules relating to the escalation panel. Happy to take any questions or provide further clarification, Chair. Thank you.
Let's start off with any questions for clarification. I'm not seeing any. Councillor Eddy?
Shall be mercifully brief on this. I'm broadly happy with it. 2 points. The first one was possibly a bit didactic. I was going to allude to emulating Dr. Dennis Brown, who was a Lib Dem chief whip in the Noughties, but only Guy will remember him now. But he, as an academic, he was famed for actually being very pedantic and nitpicking. And although in the minutes in the Constitution, it does stipulate that every policy committee could create up to 2 for task and finish groups in a year, it says in our recommendations 2. So I would suggest we actually have up to. The other thing about the escalation panel, we've only had one in October. Admittedly, it came from in relation to a decision which was a non-key decision of myself and the chair. But apart from my own views about the effectiveness of the chairmanship of that panel, the fact we've only had one in the first year to date suggests we probably got something right in the rules.
Thank you, Councillor Eddy. I feel that I remember Councillor Brown with a great degree of affection, and whilst he was, I would say, rigorous about detail, he was right far more often than he was wrong. It struck me as being a great shame that he and Councillor Stevens, former Councillor Stevens, have never met, as far as I know, but Councillor Stevens did input into this committee to make a very similar point. Did I see an indication from Councillor Breyer?
Yeah, a couple of points just wanted to make on number 4, Finance Subcommittee, and number 5, Policy Development and Task and Finish Group. So number 4, Finance Subcommittee, I think there might be it's a sort of grey area it feels like it falls into to some extent, is that it obviously is helping in supporting in the development of the budget, but it isn't in itself a decision-making group. And so I wonder whether we need to clarify that, but whether it's fine as it is. But it feels to me like a number of people feel that it is more of a decision-making body, even though it is actually, technically speaking, scrutiny. I don't know whether people feel that needs clarifying, but that seemed to me to be something that arose when looking through this. Do you want to do that first?
Yeah, can I come straight? And hopefully we might do. Yeah, I found Finance Subcommittee really interesting and in some ways challenging. And I am glad this report acknowledges some inconsistency. You haven't quite, I assume maybe we're going to come back with what the inconsistency was and suggested changes, hopefully for the, because there is this point of support the development and developing. And my experience, and Andrew's is probably quite similar in terms of us sitting, me as deputy leader, but you as a committee chair, big decisions about the budget are going to have some political leadership from committee chairs and from the leader of the council. So there's this interesting division between those positions developing the budget and then another group. And I think support the development is a good way of wording that, but because of my previous role as vice chair of budget scrutiny, so I in the position of not having loads of experienced councillors, I was one of the more experienced actually, along with Andrew, who was sat on budget scrutiny with me for many years, in terms of seeing us through this process. But the process was a little bit complicated. I think we actually did work it out quite well at the end, but yes, I'm keen to see that inconsistency between the various places referred to corrected. And yes, in some way, I think support the development of the budget is correct. I think it would be very complicated to say a group of councillors who are not the leader or committee chairs developed the budget or made the overall decisions about the budget would be quite difficult to do.
Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo those points. I hadn't really anticipated saying much on this section because we've on the work programme we've got the budget setting process as a whole to discuss next time around. I think the only other thing I would maybe make an observation is, you know, in every committee, every group, you know, nominated members to committees in line with their own procedures and stuff. And I sort of inherited it based on my previous experience of being on the the finance task and finish group. What I think might be useful would be a greater overlap, and I don't actually roll back a little bit. I'm not sure the extent to which there was an overlap between members of the S&R committee and members of the finance subcommittee. I would think it would be better if it was more genuinely a subcommittee of S&R, so that when those S&R members then came to look at the budget as a whole, they had been through that whole process of the sort of scrutiny and briefings about the evolving medium-term financial strategy and then the evolving budget proposals that got to the point of the budget. So that would be an observation. I grant that that's a lot of work because members of S&R have monthly meetings, unlike the rest of, you know, those of us on other committees. And there was, I think, a dozen sessions of the finance subcommittee over quite a short period of time. So it would be it is a big time commitment, so it's not something I think we should necessarily codify, because we have to recognise that, you know, members have a variety of different circumstances and other responsibilities. But I think it would be preferable with more if there was a degree, you know, a great degree of overlap between the two.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. Seeing as we've gone into number 4, does anyone else have anything to... Tim?
Thank you, Chair. Just to pick up the point around where we need the clarification to ensure consistency, and I think Councillor Mack has summarised it quite succinctly, in fact, because the consistency sits with the terms of reference in Part 3 of the Constitution, and not in the budget and policy framework procedure rules, which actually set out the detail around how the process works. So I think we're really substituting 3 words for 2 and changing responsible to support. And I think if that's okay with the working group, we'll just get that actioned as part of the formal changes in due course. But you know, in practice, that's how the process operated this year.
That sounds like something to bring back to our conversation specifically on the budget setting procedure in terms of a recommendation and a constitutional amendment to do that, unless there's any objection. Sounds like we're there. Fantastic.
Chair, if I may, I could probably do it under my delegation to deal with inconsistencies and updates to the Constitution without it needing a formal resolution. I think this one is probably falls into that category. Yeah, we can pick it up in any event in due course. Thanks.
Councillor Mack.
Unless, of course, when we discuss the process, someone here proposes that subgroup sets and decides. So that's all I'm saying is, do we want to wait for that discussion? Because it might be proposed that there are a number of changes to both of those documents.
I'm going to stick very rigorously to the nothing's agreed till everything's
Oh.
agreed.
I'm
I
not
anticipated.
saying yet this meeting.
Fantastic, cool. But it does sound like we've got a way to move forward in the absence of any other substantial changes in this area. So that's positive. I think in terms of the other discussion points that have been... Oh, Councillor Brown. I did come to you, didn't I? Sorry. I'm going to be anxious about that for the rest of the meeting. Councillor Breyer, please.
I was just going to move on to number 5. Is that all right? Is that what you'd like to do now? What would you like to wait?
It was just to say that I think some of the discussion about points 2 and 3, well, 3, I think we've largely dealt with. 2, scrutiny under the committee model of governance. I think some of that discussion happened in our previous agenda meeting. Some of it I know will be coming back when we talk about area committees. Beyond that, I wasn't detecting anything we hadn't sort of touched on already. You know, without reopening that debate, I was going to say I think that how well the committees are able to scrutinise depends on how able we are to deliver on our previous discussion. Does that make sense? If the decision pathway and the way that we get things on the agenda for these is wrong, then they can't scrutinise and they can't perform that function. If we can get that working really, really well, then they can. So to me, those 2 issues are really, really interlinked. A huge part of the challenge of this committee is the amount of interlinking that there is, which is, as I say, why we agreed the nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. So, unless anyone wants to raise anything on that, I will move on to 5, Councillor Breyer.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to share experience of the task and finish groups. Obviously, I chair the curbside and parking strategy task and finish group. I think the key thing from that has been 2 things, actually. One is the fact that it sometimes isn't clear at the outset when you set these things up through whatever policy committee it's coming through, what exactly is the resource implication? What's the timeline? You know, these kind of... I think it is clear what the timeline is usually to start with. It's usually that civic year. But we found with this one that it has, much like actually the Committee Model Review Group, had too much to deal with in that amount of time. And I suppose that relates to the second aspect, which is that we found it's become... I was going to use a very specific phrase there, which I won't use. A repository for people, for other issues that are related to curbside and parking, but perhaps aren't strategic issues, but more immediate issues, to come to that meeting. And so for me, those are specifics, obviously, for that group, but I wonder whether other task and finish groups have found similarly that it's quite difficult to keep within your remit, but also to just be clear about how long it's going to take, the process is going to take. And we're sort of, I suppose we're constrained by the idea of a civic year because we go May to May and that we want to do it for that amount of time. But actually, maybe we just need to be aware that we need to be realistic with how long things take.
Yeah, I'm actually currently chairing 2 task and finish groups because I love them. So one was suggested, the property disposals one was just suggested that a couple of meetings might brief us pretty well and have a good discussion. And I was like, I don't think that's going to cover it. And I think we're now looking at going into our 6th. And also a case of the remit expanding. It's difficult because there are so many subjects, and when you have a group that has already formed to discuss an area, so we're talking about property, and then there's conversations about community asset transfers, and you don't want to say, well, we have a cross-party group, and I want that subject to have people having a cross-party group to discuss it. So you don't want to say no when there's an opportunity for something to have that sort of collaborative discussion, but it can expand and expand. I don't know about the municipal year. I don't know how much that's a requirement. Yeah, I was going to say, I think that you can set a timescale. I certainly have been pushed more on how many meetings, what the meetings might look like, trying to work that one out in advance. So, before we went to whips and asked, could people be a member? Everyone was like, well, what is it and how long is it? So I think that is something that would be really helpful to set in advance. I guess it's really difficult. I'm going to say something like, it's the discipline of setting agendas and getting through the work. And I realise that all of our work could be massive and ongoing, and we could probably all sit in rooms for 8 hours discussing any subject. So how do we get that balance between giving everyone enough time to discuss every single subject and also getting through the amount of work in a time that is reasonable, and also that our officers have enough time to support the span of policy that or working groups that we want to do? So I feel like that's just a number of ideas. It's a compromise between a number of factors there.
Thanks, Councillor Mack. For what it's worth, because this has been an ongoing theme, I think, in discussions around committee model review, is that there will be times when the solution to a problem identified is not constitutional and is not to do with process, it's simply political. As in, is the chair willing to make time to talk about this thing or not? And I think that it plays into the conversation that we had earlier. It is perfectly reasonable for a chair or for a committee to say, that is a worthy issue, that is an important issue, that is a key issue. Is it the absolutely most important use of that bit of time and resource that we've got for discussion? Sometimes maybe not. And also, for what it's worth, I do think if an awful lot of issues that some communities in the city are very passionate about, we're able to take those concerns to an area committee and deal with them there, I think that would save an awful lot of time spent in this place, looking at things from a city-wide point of view. But I do think this might well be one of those areas where it is for committee chairs and committees themselves to say, we just don't have time in the short term to look at this. We don't have time to accommodate it with resource, and we will be held politically accountable for that. And that, I think that's perfectly reasonable, as long as that decision is made in a transparent way. It's the one caveat. I'll come to Councillor Bryant and then Councillor Self.
I just wanted to clarify that I think it's less that it shouldn't come there. It's more that it's more suitable somewhere else sometimes, and there's not a sort of middle ground between a task and finish group and the committee itself. So it's short of wanting to take something in full form to a committee, rather to get informal feedback. It often falls into it has fallen into the task and finish group, rather than it being like, well, we're actually going to have just a separate meeting on this and talk about it with the whole committee in some way. And I wonder whether there's a scope for us to think about how we can set up an additional structure. I know, adding another committee. No, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying adding another committee, but for specific immediate issues, sometimes it isn't. It's more immediate than having to go straight to the transport committee or the policy committee in question. I don't think that that's been sort of teased out yet about what happens then, because really we can only make the full decision at the transport committee, but if you want informal feedback, where does that go?
Apologies. Yes. Please.
Members, just to remind you all that we do have the standing all-member briefing slot, which is every other Wednesday, and any member can ask for a topic to be added to that. So that might be a useful, first thing that you could do to find out information about something. And then again, as I said earlier, then you can decide, between you, cross-party next steps, etc., etc.
I should say I did, in conversations ahead of this meeting, a form of words had cropped up that occurred to me might help with this, because obviously there are times when a member of council will wish to look into a policy area informally and develop their own views, and that could be through members' briefings, that could be talking to outside bodies, that could be talking to other councillors. But what I thought we might want to add, possibly to the roles and responsibilities of the chairs of policy committees, was something along the lines of where a committee member has been tasked with liaising with officers or interested parties to develop a specific area of policy, the chair shall ensure that it shall be by agreement between the member concerned and the committee. And in that case, it would be perfectly possible for the committee chair of the committee to say, Councillor, I was suddenly casting my eyes around and settling on chairs. Councillor Self, would you mind investigating a feasibility study or looking into how we might do better on night buses, and come back to us having liaised with officers and these different groups with a report in the future? All those in favour? And then that gives us a mechanism very easily for simply tasking a member, if they want to, if they wish to go off and liaise with officers. And then that way, at least, we know we're not overburdening officers' time without the consent of the committee. And if there is an issue around prioritisation or an issue around resource, it's a perfect opportunity for an officer to discreetly say, not sure we've quite got time, given the forward agenda. Maybe that should come back in 8 months, 6 months, next meeting, whatever it might be. But it at least allows us to acknowledge that work being done and that member has shown an interest and put the time in. Does that sound amenable to everyone? I saw an indication from Councillor Mack.
I couldn't remember if you were waiting.
You've kind of set me off on a bit of a different tangent. I was going to be talking about task and finish groups, so I'm quite happy for Heather to speak first.
I'll comment quickly on this, and then, this sort of came from a conversation of us. And sitting on S&R, we've already acknowledged twice as many meetings and massive agendas, and the chair of S&R is also the leader of the council. And so the subject area within strategy and resources, this is no criticism of Councillor Dyer. I think it is very hard for one chair, one person, to dive into all of the areas that are within that. And so I think that the ability to delegate in some way, but that being in a transparent way, that the rest of the committee know that's happening, and that the chair is, and also that sort of confirmation, it is about officer resource. So that confirmation that the chair is saying that this is an area of interest for the committee, please put some resource into it, because to an extent it is tricky, but there has to be some balance of not every councillor jumping into a subject of interest and saying, can we have all the officer time to look into this area of interest if there's not a commitment to policy being developed in that area. And I feel like this wording, because we had discussed it, is a good compromise of allowing that to happen. I was trying to pull in Councillor Self, but I am also interested, as the committee chair here, what Councillor Brown thinks in terms of, does that sound like something that would work within your committee and would be helpful for you to be able to work with your members like that?
Potentially, and I can actually see, I'm sure there are areas where there are specific interests within the committee that could be pursued through this sort of route, and I shall pretend to be a good delegator.
So we all. Tim.
Thanks, Chair. Just to temper enthusiasm for this particular way of working, we do need to acknowledge that the chair and the vice chair have specific responsibilities set out in the Constitution, and because they have those responsibilities, they're entitled to a special responsibility allowance. If we're moving to a model where individual members of the committee are then being given additional responsibilities, we need to understand what the implications of that might be in terms of the independent remuneration panel, and that may well be where we want to go. I just think we need to understand what if we are asking individual members to lead on something that is out with the arrangements that we have already. We just need to think through and properly design what that will look like and what that might mean in terms of their responsibilities, and we would need to pick something like that up if it had legs and with the independent remuneration panel in due course.
I'll come to. If you wish to add something on this specific point, I will then definitely come back to you for task and finish. Councillor Judge?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point, Tim. I think if someone's getting paid to do a certain job and then they don't want to do part of that job and then they try and give it to somebody else to do for free, I agree with you. I don't think that's an acceptable point. So if we are going to formalise that, then I agree with you that you probably have to pay the rate for the job for that individual to do that work.
Well, I say let's look at the proposal when it comes back, at which point I will move us on to task and finish groups and Kaz's point.
Yeah, so really wanted to speak about my experience of task and finish groups, but just to come back on a few points been made, move on to just briefly to policy development. It did catch my eye on things like commission research and do things they reasonably consider to inform their deliberations. That's just caught my eye as something that perhaps I need to think of. But in terms of task and finish groups, I've been on 2 task and finish groups now. One was the supported bus services, which had a very clear endpoint. It had to be ready for the new buses to come in April. So that worked, and that was a really enjoyable one to be on as a task and finish group, because you had that time frame, you had this kind of clear schedule of working through things. But what I will say now, there is potentially a little bit of mission creep in there. Not I'm saying the mission creep in this case is wrong, don't get me, because we'd be looking at spending the extra money and maybe do some more night buses, which is great, but I'm sort of conscious that there is an allowance for the chair or the person who's chairing that task and finish group. If that creeps on, then should they be paid more, or should they? What's the sort of criteria for paying them? Then on the other task and finish group, which isn't sort of got these sort of time constraints, again, there's a sort of issue about how long is this going to take, and what's the kind of plan, and these sort of issues in my head, which have just concerning me, because also in terms of planning your own as an individual councillor, how much commitment you want to give these task and finish groups. I think it's just something we need to maybe have a bit of a think about. Yeah.
No, I think it's a reasonable point. Councillor Dutt.
Yeah, the only other issue that I'm worried about is kind of the known unknown, in the fact that we know there's lots of cross-cutting issues where it might be 40% of it sits with one committee, 60% with another, but because who's responsible for that particular issue isn't clear, it kind of gets left and it's not being dealt with. So and I don't think we've kind of, I guess you could say, well, the Strategy and Resources Committee is meant to be, and we've talked about that previously, it's meant to be where all those issues are dealt with, but I think it's just one of those known unknowns that we're not really dealing with, and I think there could be lots of productive work that's taking place, but because of how we've structured ourselves, that work isn't taking place, and we probably don't even know that it's not taking place because we're not thinking about it, because we're not aligned in that way.
Thank you. Any other points on this particular thing, recommendations or proposals? Food for thought. Okay, thank you very much. And I should say, sorry, I realised that could have come across as quite dismissive of the conversation that we've just had. I will put this in the bracket of we are developing, and this is something I think we should bring to chairs' attention and for chairs to bear in mind as we change our ways of using the new system that we've got. These are options, and these are things that we should be considering on the committees that we serve on and the committees that we chair. unless there's anything else on scrutiny and policy development, I'm going to move on to the little bit about escalation. Okay. So, I have had some feed into this item already, but obviously I'll go around members of the committee first. So, yeah, who would, well, first of all, Tim, do you want to say anything additional on escalation from the report?
Not specifically, Chair. I think you've got the detail in there, as members will be aware. It's certainly those who've been on the council in previous years. It's not a dissimilar process to the previous call-in arrangements we had, which, you know, as I've said here before, were used very rarely. So the fact that we've had one in the last year or 9 months is actually no surprise to me, because we probably only had 3 in the previous 5 years. So yeah, that's I was at the one escalation panel that we held, and I was satisfied with the way that the matter was dealt with and deliberated upon, and the process that sat around it, and the support that officers gave to that meeting was full and comprehensive. So I personally have no concerns with the one that we've had thus far. It's not dissimilar to what we've done in previous years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If anyone else has anything to add, please feel free to feed it. Councillor Dudd?
Yeah, all I want to say on this is, I guess, just sort of feedback from the procedure, really. I think what people really wanted to talk about was whether the issue was the right decision to take or not, and because of the process, what we were debating is whether the decision was taken correctly or not. And I think there's a different, that's a slightly different emphasis. I think in the end, the debate turned to whether it was the right decision to take or not, but the vote was on whether the decision was taken correctly. So it's just a question for, I guess, whether people are happy with that process. I guess if we're restricted to that, then that will just repeat itself when people really want to talk about whether it was the right issue or the right decision or the wrong decision. It will be about whether the decision will be taken correctly going forward, and I guess that will just keep repeating itself. So the question is, do people think that's acceptable? Surely we should have a process where people can openly discuss whether it was the wrong or right decision, rather than was the decision taken correctly or not. But if we stick with what we've got, I think people will have that debate anyway, but it just won't be what's on the papers or the vote that's taken.
No, thank you. Councillor Breyer, then Eddie? Oh, I think, was that a different... Oh, okay. Don't let me forget to next bit of it.
Yeah, I mean, just my experience of call-ins prior to the committee system was that it tended to be that councillors inevitably talk about the decision itself rather than the reasons for it. And I think that's always going to present a challenge in these kind of things. I don't think you're going to ever quite get over that to some extent. And obviously councillors can say what they want, it's open debate, isn't it? I wonder whether the threshold, I mean, is it 10, the threshold for, yeah?
The threshold was finally decided on any 10 councillors.
Yeah.
I should say the other option that the Committee Model Review Group, Committee Working Group, I should say, discussed was 5 councillors from more than one party, or any 10 councillors.
And that didn't go forward. And that was from the Committee Model
Working Group. I forget now the reason why it wasn't taken forward, but those were the 2 options that were kind of floating.
I do think there is a case for making it 2 party groups, but the problem with that, of course, is our current council maker, we've got 4 party groups, right? So you could argue now it's reasonable, even if not popular, to do that. But we could end up with just one of the, we could end up in a situation at some point in our future or history or whatever, where we only have 2 parties. So I don't think we should set up a constitutional precedent that does say that, actually. I mean, unlikely in Bristol, but it could happen. So I think if you're going to set things up to be future-proofed, you should probably stick with what we've got, actually, yeah.
Councillor Eddie.
constructive questioning of good. So I do think that's correct. Keep it as it is.
I will come to Councillor Brown, then to Tim.
Yeah, I was going to raise this because it was something I raised in the chamber when we had a report to full council way back when. I mean, I think I would be in favour of it being from more than one group, but if the mood's not in the room, I'm not going to, die on this particular hill.
Thank you, Tim. Then Councillor Mack.
I just want to raise the point that I raised, I think, at the last meeting, actually, when we touched on this. So the principles in Article 14 of the Constitution, to which reference needs to be paid when a matter is escalated, are basic principles of public law, and they are the grounds ostensibly upon which a challenge by way of judicial review could be brought against a decision that the council has made. But any decision that is challenged by way of judicial review is not looking at whether the decision was the right decision to take or not. It is looking at the process and the governance and compliance with administrative procedures of public law, and therefore the same principles are embedded in our escalation panel process. And it's not for a court of law to impose on the decision maker their view, and equally it's not really for the escalation panel to impose on the decision maker, who is properly constituted and authorised to make a decision, an alternative view, given that they are empowered to do so. But if the check and balance is to be satisfied that they have made the decision in the right and proper way, not whether or not they have whether or not they agree with the decision, because there will be decisions that, day in, day out, there will be a divergence of views as to whether or not they are the right decision. But we are not escalating every single decision just because somebody else doesn't agree with it. So, there needs to be those safeguards around how the escalation panel works, and that is consistent with principles of public law and the way that judicial review is dealt with through the courts of law.
Councillor Mack, then Councillor Self.
I do agree that it should be multiple parties. I do sort of see Councillor Breyer's point about future-proofing this, but I think if it's about process, and this current process is about process, there's a lot of repetition of process there, then I wouldn't want it to start being such a political point. I want it that their case for the problem could be made across multiple groups. So I agree with that. I think it's a really interesting question about how do you actually just disagree with a decision? And I guess the point is that there are different political groups, different values, different leaders with different values, or committee chairs across the council, and certain have been put in positions of power, and we're going to disagree with each other, but ultimately the ones that have been put into those positions, responsibility is their views that get taken forward. So it feels like escalation panel, this process that exists, is not the one to challenge actual decisions based on values. My question might be, would there be something else? I feel like Tim's going to look at me for like, what? But decisions going back to it, like in the case of the one escalation panel, is there something about the decision going to the committee? Because it does feel like it should be a committee that would confirm whether there's support for a decision, not this separate escalation panel. The escalation panel seems to make sense for process, but not for the actual subject. It should be those on the specific policy committee looking at the actual decision.
I have Kai, Kaz, and then Richard, and I wanted to weigh in on this, but I will just, for the purposes of clarity, I'm sure Tim will correct me if I'm wrong, the difference between escalation panel and reviewing a decision in a policy committee is the ability to stop the decision being enacted, is my understanding. That's the purpose of the escalation panel. And why it fulfills a judicial function is that it has that ability to say, and the previous decision taken will not be taken forward until this has happened. As in that's its function as a backstop. Reviewing a bad decision, I think, is something we've kind of brushed up already. But I'll come to
I don't have any problem with the current thresholds. I think if you changed it to include another party, I think that would be like an outrageous attack on our powers as an opposition to bring things forward. So I wouldn't support that. at all, really. I think that would be an outrageous thing to do to us as an opposition party.
Thank you. I'll move on to Kaz.
Yeah, I was just wanted to pick up on what Heather and Tim previously said. I'm not a lawyer, but if a decision is made, you've got the option of taking it to a higher level of court. So what we're kind of saying is our highest level here is kind of maybe full council. We can't, there's no way of going above that. I don't know if you've got any sort of thoughts on, these kind of decisions. It is possible that full council could make a bad decision. What can be done about it is a question in my head.
I come to Richard, and I have a question for Tim.
Just on a point of accuracy, Heather made the point, is there more a point of asking the committee to actually re-examine the decision? Having this arose my policy committee, it wasn't a key decision, didn't need to be taken to committee, but based upon what I would say is, as I've said, we've all been on a huge learning curve, and it may be last year people were less au fait with the powers which were aware. So the minutes are sent to every member of the committee within days, and they have an opportunity to raise issues, and members certainly of our policy committee have on a regular basis. No one actually raised this issue.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. So my question for Tim was this, well, twofold really. One is, I had not appreciated that aspect, the public law aspect of escalation panels necessarily fully. Is it the case, if it's that kind of process question, that there's a quasi-judicial element to the escalation panel, as in with those elements of public law, such as the rule against predetermination, potentially apply to the escalation panel?
So principles around ethical conduct are part of the criteria for considering whether a matter should be escalated or not. The highest standards of ethical conduct, avoiding actual, potential and perceived conflicts of interest, is one of the criteria set out in Article 14 of the Constitution. So, so that would cover off that.
In effect, the same rule against bias that was basically the same thing that applies to all policy committees and decisions of full council, for that matter.
That applies across the board,
Across the board. In terms then of being able to call something to escalation panel, it then strikes me that the way of calling it to escalation panel, the threshold is lower for calling something back to full council, obviously without that power to issue a sort of stop notice, as it were, on the decision. In other words, you could call something to full council by calling a meeting of full council through the procedure you outlined earlier, with fewer members than the escalation panel. I forget how many people it takes to call a meeting of full council.
What you have to remember, there's a very short window once the decision has been made and published before a matter can be escalated. If you're wanting to call a full council meeting, obviously you would miss that window, which is why the escalation process holds the decision in abeyance until the escalation panel has met. If you weren't using that process, then and you were calling a full council meeting, and it may not be to unpick the decision or to review the decision. It might be to do a lessons learned, perhaps, which again is something that because going back to the earlier conversation, we were talking about, well, yes, the emphasis tends to be on whether it was the right decision or not whether not whether the correct process was followed. That maybe lends itself more to, well, was it the right thing to do? Are there any lessons to be learnt from that? Should there be something that we can take forward and reflect upon for future decision making? That is something that can be done out with that process. But the escalation itself is quite strict in terms of timing, because a decision has been taken. The escalation panel needs to meet within a defined period of time, so that the decision is either. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Thank you.
In which case, I'll put the question back to to Kai and Kat. Is it more the case that you would want to be able to reassess the merits of a decision already made, in light of, for example, new evidence, or in other words, would it be okay to bring a decision back to committee already made to say, look, we think we got this wrong, or is it to actually stop the decision being made that you're looking at? In which case, I think the escalation panel probably is the right solution.
Yeah, I just think genuinely people wanted to debate whether it was the right decision to take or not whether the process was followed in the correct manner. So I guess, it's been clear. It's clear that the escalation panel isn't the correct process to have that debate, but people use it and have that debate anyway. And like Tim said, you can call a full council, you can call a committee meeting, but I guess that would be subject to the 6-month rule, wouldn't it? So if you wanted to call an emergency subcommittee meeting to discuss a decision, then surely you can't revisit that decision for 6 months, can you? Under the 6-month rule.
Please.
Well, you could call a meeting to discuss something. Whether overturning the decision would fall foul of the 6 months rule. But you could have, you could call, if a decision was taken today, in a month's time, you could call a committee, an extraordinary meeting to discuss that particular matter. But it couldn't overturn that decision for at least a period of 6 months. But it could initiate, if there was the consensus to do so, some lessons learned work, some, a further report back on, the progress of implementation, to give greater, assurance around what, the decisions that's been taken and how it's been taken forward. There's various ways that you would do it, but it wouldn't be able to just overturn the decision. And I think that has to be right. There has to be a degree of certainty when the council makes decisions that those decisions will stand and will be implemented. Otherwise, we run the risk of finding decisions that not everyone likes, and we end up overturning.
Thank you. I've had indications from 2 more members. I am also aware that we've just hit 12 o'clock and we're out of time, and people may have other places to be. So I could propose that we either extend time briefly, but knowing how busy members of this committee and the officers that clerk it are and probably have to go immediately, we don't have that option. Fair enough. In which case, I'm going to have conversations following this meeting, and I would imagine we will just bring some of this item back to the next meeting and hope that we can get to a position of more clarity in between now and then. Is that okay with everybody? Apologies. I know it's not ideal, but I do think that this is something we need to bottom out, and just giving 15 minutes to the next meeting to that would be good.
Chair, just so we're clear, so it sounds like it's just the escalation panel of this report that is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I will let you all go. Thank you for a genuinely, I think, quite provocative, but I think quite productive meeting. Oh, bless you. I always feel terrible when we run out of time on something really meaty, but here we are. Thanks, everybody.